The file from the records room looks ordinary. A 3x5 index card, pencil-shaded lines neat as rice rows, a clipped metal corner smelling faintly of oil and dust. Under the lamplight's amber circle, the Archivist's calipers whisper across its edge, the thin cardboard just under a millimeter thick, its weight barely felt in the palm. On one side, a notation, POW requested death, request refused, the words tight, cautious, routine. It rubs against an old wartime myth, the one that insists there were no choices, only frenzy and annihilation, only men who never surrendered and others who never hesitated. The card offers a quieter measurement, a refusal shaped by policy, by practice, and by human hands. It comes from a pile of thousands, each clipped, stamped, and filed as grey as the dust that settles on the clerk's sleeve. Among these slips, men speak without shouting. Many asked for an ending. Someone listening said no and then wrote it down. If this calms you, please subscribe. The lamp in the medic's tent is a trembling globe of yellow far out on a damp island night where the canvas walls smell of iodine and mildew. A Nisei interpreter kneels on the packed earth beside a wounded Japanese conscript whose eyes shine like polished obsidian in the low light. The soldier's whisper creaks like an unstopped door. The request is simple, the word for death heavy in air that tastes of salt and iron. The interpreter steadies his voice. The corpsman lays a dry hand on a wet wrist, and the American rifleman stands just outside the flap, listening to rain stitch thin needles through the dark. The request is refused without grandeur, no ceremony, only a practiced gentleness, weapon removed, bandage tied, stretcher lifted. The interpreter promises rice tomorrow, writes a note on a small tag that pricks his thumb. The prisoner stares at the canvas roof and closes his eyes. The tent sighs as wind presses it inward and then lets it go. Field orders spoke plainly in that era. Prisoners would be taken whenever possible, treated, questioned, logged, and guarded. That directive, stamped in carbon paper and pushed through clattering typewriter keys, made a ritual of refusal. A request for death might come as a murmur from a litter, as a gesture toward a sheathed blade, as a throat's single sharp syllable, as the quiet slide of a grenade toward a belly. The Americans had a structure for that moment. The glove snapping into place, the muzzle angled high, the grenade lifted away like a hot potato, the interpreter's hand raised, palm out. The value of that structure was not abstract. It shielded those who followed it from a different kind of injury, the collapse of boundaries, the erosion of the law's shelter. It also gave shape to intelligence work. If a prisoner lived, maps were drawn, supply routes traced, tiny truths stacked like coins. The typewriter rang at the end of each line and the paper smelled faintly of gum and ink. On black sand that clung to boots and lips, a Marine remembered the first time a captured man asked for a blade. Rain had made pearls on the canvas of the Marine's poncho, and the ocean breathed slowly beyond a dark rank of rocks. The prisoner's hand had crept to his side, toward a short knife tucked invisibly along a belt seam, his pupils dilated, his face beautifully calm. The Marine sergeant had moved faster than the moment, pulling the knife away and flattening it with a boot heel, the leather leaving a quiet stamp on the wet metal. No one raised their voice. The sea hissed. The prisoner stared at the broken blade and shook with a small sob that felt older than the island. Refusal can be soft, the Marine wrote later, almost like letting go. He poured water over the edge of a canteen into the man's open mouth, careful not to spill a drop, as if feeding a sparrow by hand. Some refusals happened far from sand and jungle. On a destroyer's steel deck, drenched in spray that perfumed the air with salt, sailors heaved nets heavy with living weight, pulling men from water that churned like glass ground to milk. One of the survivors touched his rescuer's sleeve and bowed his head, then pressed his hand to his chest and to the sea, asking without words to be lowered back down. The boatswain shook his head and smiled without showing teeth. He pulled the man up by both hands and guided him toward a steaming bucket of broth, the ladle clacking softly against the rim. The wind made sails of shirts hung to dry, and a gull far from any port cried once and vanished into the cloud low and heavy on the horizon. The rescued man's fingers trembled, then curled around the tin cup. The deck thrummed with the engine's heart. The sea asked. The answer remained no. The tide breathed and turned. The sand remembers. Instruments hum. The hollow waits. The engine thrum settles in the chest like a second pulse. In field hospitals perfumed by ether and bleach, surgeons made refusals with needle and thread. A prisoner, his legs blistered by fire and earth, mouthed words that an orderly could half hear over the drip of water into enamel basins. The request carried traditions older than the operating table. It carried a family's code, a teacher's counsel, a drilled cadence of honor. The surgeon steadied his breathing and stitched, the suture gliding through skin that felt warm beneath his fingers, the knot tying like a finishing bow on a package. The translator beside him did not translate the request into English. He translated it into a plea to live long enough to write home. That was not a lie. It was a choice to take one cord of the warp and weave a different pattern. Outside, a lantern swung from a pole, making the shadows in the ward swim. Inside, a pencil tapped softly against a clipboard, recording pulse, pressure, and the quiet stubbornness of a rule obeyed. Silence rose around these moments in that era, a useful silence that softened edge stories. At home, posters declared the enemy fanatical, monstrous, relentless, suggesting there would be no prisoners and no mercy, as if the war had stripped all bodies of their ordinary longings. In camp newsletters and hometown papers, the tales that made easy sense were told first. A corporal who wrestled a suicide from a prisoner's hands sometimes found the story gently edited away, not because it was shameful, but because it disrupted the cadence of certainty that kept distant kitchens quiet. The censorship of kindness can be tidy. A public information officer with sleeves rolled to the elbow reads a passage and draws his pencil through it. The graphite leaves a pleasingly smooth line. Meanwhile, pocket diaries sourced with sweat and mildew survive under cot mattresses and in sea bags, waiting to be opened by later hands. Those diaries smell of mildew and the sweet ink of a fountain pen nib making a slow trail across paper. On Saipan in 1944, a Marine corporal wrote of a boy soldier, face scarcely shadowed by stubble, who crawled from a hollow salted with coral dust and lifted both hands, empty and shaking. The boy's voice, brittle as old bamboo, carried a request shaped like resignation. He asked for a bullet with the steadiness of someone holding back a tide. The corporal did not understand the words, but he knew the tone, a tone heard in the sickly glow of pre-dawn when rain finds the seams of your tent, when you half dream of your own pillow. He called softly for the interpreter, who came with a handkerchief tied at the neck and a pencil tucked behind one ear. The interpreter's answer was slow and low. The corporal knelt, took the boy's canteen and poured water into a cupped hand. Rice would come later. The boy cried without sound, tears mixing with gritty dust, and then pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The act of refusing created intelligence that sang on maps, in marks of grease pencil that didn't wash off with one wipe. A prisoner's living memory traced the path of a hidden track through tall grass, or the location of an artillery telephone cable draped invisible beneath a footbridge. That refused bullet became a saved patrol the next night. It materialized as a stack of lives placed back on shelves. In a dim room where the fan blades chopped the warm air into even pieces, a lieutenant leaned over a green felt table, pushed pins into a chart, and moved a string a fraction of an inch. What does a refusal weigh in a storm? The answer appeared in a different column, in lighter casualty figures, in a convoy arriving with fewer holes. Sometimes the prisoner spoke only after soup, sometimes after a cigarette's ember collapsed, sometimes not at all. Still, the refusal protected a shape of decency that, like a compass needle, kept seeking north. Caves worked as their own kind of opera hall, echoes looping, voices stretched thin over limestone and fear. Interpreters carried megaphones shiny as kettle sides and called down into throat-like openings, promising food and bandages, pointing to leaflets that showed cups of tea and a rice bowl, a tent with a red cross painted in careful strokes. A handful of men emerged blinking like turtles, the rock sweat clinging to them, their hands lifted, their eyes cautious. On the lip of the cave, one man bowed and asked softly, not for water, but for a chance to die as a soldier, and pressed his palms together in a prayer gesture. The interpreter looked down to the megaphone, a silly thing now, and then up into the man's face. He shook his head, slowly. He held out a biscuit that flaked under fingers. The cave exhaled stale air that tasted of bat guano and damp cloth. The men followed the biscuit onto the path into custody, step after step. The surf lulls. The cave breathes. The paper megaphone gleams. Somewhere, a kettle starts to sing without a stove. Even bureaucracy had a pulse. In a tent with an uneven floor of wooden slats, a clerk typed on a portable with a ribbon that left words slightly ghosted at the edges. His desk rattled when someone walked by. He recorded, among a day's worth of routine, the note that a prisoner preferred death to captivity, the phrasing formal but not unkind. He pulled a thin blanket over his lap in the draft and licked the tip of his pencil before adding a reference number. That file might be promoted to a summary report or exiled to a stack that would travel, in a crate nailed shut, across a long ocean home. The file kept its ordinariness, grey string tying it closed, a smear of coffee gone pale at the edge. It would be too easy to fail to notice how meticulous care taken in that tent rolled forward as policy, as training, as a tone sustained between men whose hands had been taught to do damage and then told to hold still. Letters crossed the same ocean with hand-stamped censor blocks and neat kanji tucked between folds, stitched by family ritual into lacquered boxes that hid among incense and framed photos. Some letters survived storms and storage and a grandchild's careful curiosity. One described a soldier preserved by strangers who would not grant his hunted wish. He wrote about the smell of tar on a stretcher handle, the way a guard adjusted a blanket's corner, the bittersweet taste of coffee he had never tried before, too strong and oddly sweet. His family kept this letter in an envelope that yellowed, the glue crackling like thin ice when opened, and a faint perfume of old paper hovered like a ghost. The letter did not become part of the loud record. The public story preferred silhouettes. Instead, it lived in a house shrine, in a drawer that smelled of cedar, in the mind of a woman who polished the wood and remembered the precise way her brother formed the curve of an O when he wrote. On Okinawa in 1945, the caves were deep and the rumors were deeper. Civilians hid, hands over children's mouths, and waited for footsteps they believed would bring unspeakable harm. Marines reached the openings and refused to be what rumor had scripted for them. They noisily approached not to surprise but to be heard, speaking through interpreters who called for calm, offering biscuits, tin cups of soup, blankets that smelled of moths and salt. A woman in a dark dress, dust clinging to the hem, asked to be shot because she believed capture would destroy the last of her family's honor. Her voice cracked like old pottery. A private took a piece of candy from his pocket, unwrapped it slowly, and held it out. The little boy in her arms watched the candy and then the hand. She reached forward, took it, and spoke something like a prayer. The refusal to grant her request opened a path down the slope, into a tent, into a world where rumors loosened their hold. By then, the value of refusing had become a quiet architecture that held up entire rooms. In a storm, refusal looked like a steadying hand and 1,000 daily gestures, the cup placed just so, the bandage tied not too tight, the weapon catalogued and locked away. The job mattered because it preserved the shared grammar that men on both sides would need after the guns went silent, a grammar of bodies as bodies rather than symbols. It mattered because a living prisoner sometimes wrote a letter that stitched back a family's torn seam. It mattered because a refusal not only saved the prisoner, it saved the refuser from the corrosive ease of granting what was asked. Rain drummed on tarpaulins like fingers tapping a table. The mess tent smelled of damp wool and soup-skin. The night radio hissed and clicked and found the right frequency. The lantern lowers, breath slows, canvas sighs. The old oath keeps its warmth like a coal cupped in two hands. Interpreters in those campaigns did more than trade nouns and verbs. They became bridges, coaxing men back from edges with tone and timing, refusing to carry over words that could ignite an ending. An interpreter might hear a POW ask to write one last letter of confession and translate it as a letter of introduction, changing orientation rather than intention. He might turn "kill me" into "do not leave me," sliding the request into a shape that invited care rather than compelled the guard to a deadly courtesy. These choices were not deceitful. They were humane alignments within orders that forbade killing prisoners. The interpreters' boots smeared with clay, their cheeks chapped by wind. They occupied a border zone of responsibility stretched thin as a drumhead. The staccato of distant mortar rounds filled the intervals between sentences. The taste of unlit cigarettes hung on the air. A hand rested briefly on a sleeve when words failed, and that touch became its own lexicon. Naval Corpsmen wrote in their logs about patients who asked, before morphine fogged the edges of pain, to be left untended so wounds could complete what battle had begun. They refused, not out of cruelty, but from a calling that did not grade patients by uniform color. The needle-kissed skin, the tourniquet cinched, the antiseptic tingled where iodine painted its orange halo. A corpsman once described lifting a man's hand from his own throat, where he was pressing to choke off breath, and instead guiding that hand to grip a rolled towel, a thing to hold rather than a way to end. The deck pitched and smelled of fuel and brine. The metal cup hung by a hook made a melodic ping when it swung and tapped, a small metronome counting out a long night. He recorded the vital signs with stubby pencil and put the notebook back into his breast pocket, where it warmed against his skin. The sea remembers. Nets drip. The hatch clangs. Commands that save lives can be whispered, and they still hold. A pilot whose plane had folded like paper into the sea drifted in a raft, the sun a white disk behind thin cloud. He had tossed away his sidearm, had no blade, only a small flag, and he raised it firmly when a seaplane descended and skipped to a halt nearby, the engine spitting and settling into a heavy idle. He signaled that he would not be rescued, the gesture crisp, as if executing a drill. The Americans answered with a grappling hook cast true. It missed. Another line arced across the water and fell near the raft, the rope supple and clean. A crewman on the wing waved, smiled, and mouthed something reassuring the pilot could not hear. The pilot shook his head again and gripped the raft's edge. The crewman stopped smiling. He bent, took the rope in both hands and pulled. The raft scudded forward over ripples that slapped the hull, and then hands, fingers ragged with salt, took hold of the pilot's wrists and refused to let go. In after-action reports, tucked between counts of ammunition expended and lists of rations consumed, appeared notes about prisoners who tried to turn belts into nooses or chewing gum tinfoil into razor-thin blades. Guards stopped them with an economy of motion, a practiced calm that suggested training and the coordination of men who had seen many attempts. The guard's knuckles might scrape a wall, blood might smear in dry brown under thumbnail. The prisoner would be placed back onto his cot, perhaps with his ankles gently bound with cloth to prevent another attempt. The tin cups on a shelf rattled when a truck passed outside. The chalk on the floor marked the next shift's post, a square of duty. The report language flattened the adrenaline into something countable, and yet between the lines, anyone who has sat with a friend through a bad night would sense the same ritual: stay awake, breathe together, keep sharp objects out of reach, wait for dawn. The myth that surrender never happened, that requests to die were always granted in the field by one side or the other, feels comfortable to some because it cleans the scene, sweeps away complexity like a broom pushing sand into a smooth, obedient line. But the record resists that smoothing. Men asked to be killed and were not. Men asked to be spared death and were. The refusal opened a channel for intelligence that included small details easily overlooked. The password traded at a fork in the road, the way rations smelled near a fuel dump, a sergeant's habit of humming a certain hymn that carried through foliage. In a room with a single bulb, a question came, then a second, then a third. Patience added depth. How often is compassion in war nothing more and nothing less than the stubborn application of a rule? The bulb's filament glowed and buzzed, the sound like a mosquito that never quite settled. Across inspection lines chalked on dirt and cement, Red Cross visitors clicked pens, inked forms that kept track of names and numbers as if they were stitching a net that could catch men who might otherwise fall through. A POW once asked a camp officer, through a translator, to honor his request to exit life under a ritual of his choosing. He spoke straight-backed under a sky high and colorless, his eyes lined with the dust that lifted in every step taken in the yard. The officer, a man whose boots had learned to creak in cadence with orders, explained the law with a tone snug as a neatly buttoned jacket. He pointed to a manual, to a flag flying near a gate that squealed slightly when pushed open. The prisoner nodded slowly, his face a mask that gradually released its stiffness. He signed the book and was given a number. The number clicked into its place among other numbers that, together, represented a promise kept. The yard calms, ledger lines straighten. A bell somewhere rings once, then waits. The shaded porch collects the day's heat and holds it gentle as breath. A hospital ship glided like a white loaf through swell, its paint unmarred, the red emblems blooming on the hull, while below decks the air smelled of talc and laundry steam. Nurses in white smocks passed bunks where men breathed in uneven chorus. A prisoner, sutured along the ribs, asked softly for a draught that would quiet him forever, a pharmacopoeia's final note. The pharmacist's mate shook his head and instead pressed into a paper cup 2 chalky tablets meant to restore and steady. He opened the little envelope and wrote, with a pencil dulled by use, a name and a time for sleep, not for ending. He turned labels away so curious eyes would not read wrong promises. The ship's propellers churned a line of bubbles into a long broken necklace that curled behind the stern. Floorboards hummed softly. Somewhere above, a gull's cry found a path through an open porthole and walked along the ward, then drifted away. On a tiny atoll where palms leaned in toward a shallow bowl of lagoon, a captured officer in a tunic that still smelled of starch asked for permission to end his life with a ritual blade. His scabbard was lacquered like wet coal, his sword hilt elegantly wrapped. He spoke to the American major in a tone that made the air feel formal, like a small ceremony had begun in the shade. The major's hand lifted, palm outward. He removed the sword from its scabbard, set it on a crate where it looked suddenly like a tool more than a relic, and then slid the scabbard back across the sand with his boot. He offered shade, water, a chair. The officer's jaw tightened, then loosened, and a small sigh rose from him like steam from tea. Later in a camp, the officer wrote that refusal had felt like anger in the moment, and mercy in retrospect, the way a doctor's pressure can pain and heal in the same touch. The sea hushes, the palm fronds clack softly, steel rests, the wind traces the sword's old path without cutting, like a finger over a scar. A chaplain in a canvas collar stretched to a shine pressed his palms together and lowered his head near a prisoner's cot. The prisoner had asked for a blessing before taking his own life, a benediction to speed him along pathways he believed would lead back to his ancestors. The chaplain could bless, but not for that purpose. He instead gave words that hung like beads on a string, patience, peace, courage, and a firm refusal braided through them like a stout thread in a garment. With his other hand, he brushed crumbs from the blanket, a simple caretaking that grounded the moment. The oil on the chaplain's wooden cross smelled of cedar. The cot's iron squeaked as someone shifted in the next bed. The prisoner stared at the chaplain's mouth, watched it form sounds that carried meaning beyond vocabulary. Finally, the prisoner drew a slow breath and turned his face toward the tent wall, where a pencil sketch of a mountain stood faint and sure. Leaflets printed in flat grey ink, with gentle drawings of cups and tents and nurses with neat hair, promised food and treatment and the chance to live beyond the clamour. They never promised any other ritual. The teams that flung them through the air from small planes or pushed them into cave mouths refused to trade in the currency of death as a negotiable term. The paper's texture felt like an old book page. When wet, it softened and adhered to skin. Some leaflets were folded into little airplanes by curious hands waiting in darkness, their creases sharp. An interpreter reading aloud from a leaflet in a cave mouth listened as a voice inside called back that death was preferable to captivity. He answered by describing the taste of broth, the chink of a spoon against enamel, the weight of a blanket heavy and warm. The words painted a room. The refusal was not merely of death, it was of emptiness, of a void where no room existed at all. On a hillside buzzing with cicadas, two medics met halfway between lines under a truce flag that fluttered without enthusiasm in air thick as syrup. One knelt beside a wounded enemy medic who had bound many limbs and now bled through his own bandage. The wounded man insisted he be left with his kit bag and his flag to let the mountain take him. The American medic shook his head and sprinkled sulfur over the wound's edge, the powder not smelling much of anything, just dry, like dust that heals. Their eyes met and did not flinch. Together they pulled the stretcher strap snug, their hands brushing, the watchers on both ridges leaning forward. The prisoner's breath slowed as the stretcher lifted. On the way down, a lizard skittered into grass, a gun oiled silently on a sling. The flag's white brightened for a moment in sun before shadow cooled it again. The refusal was an old kind of medicine made of hands and habit. The helmet presses, the road bends. Crickets count time. The hill keeps its secrets, yet the path down stays open through stubborn care. When the war's immediate thunder began to fade in the mind, some records drifted into a haze of, "We did what we had to do," a safe phrase that holds much and spills little. Boxes marked with dull pencils were moved from one shelf to another, tags came loose, fell, and were swept up with other small debris, like a lost button found years later behind a radiator. In a cave rediscovered by hikers, carved into limestone with a mess kit's edge, someone found words that asked for killing, and a reply scratched lightly beneath them, numb. The walls smelled of wet rock and dust. A bat flitted, then settled again in velvet folds of shadow. A modern flashlight's beam made the words sharper than they had been in their own day. The hikers did not know the names. They touched those letters made by strangers, and their fingertips tasted of chalk dust, a mouth recalled flavor tied to classrooms and pencils chewed through anxious afternoons. At the prison camp kitchens, where rice steamed in vats and the air felt damp and comforting, a prisoner asked for a last meal, not with a laugh or tear, but with a stillness that made the request sound like a command issued to himself. He meant it as an end cap, a final sweetness before choosing to leave. The cook, a man whose hands were trained to portion and provide, filled a bowl and set it down as always, then pulled up a stool and ate his own bowl beside the prisoner, shared from the same shaker of coarse salt. He talked of nothing much, how rain loses its anger when it becomes mist, how coffee at dawn tastes different than coffee at night. The clatter of bowls and the hiss of steam made a simple symphony. The prisoner, lulled, took second bites, then thirds. By the end of the meal, the plan had become an old coat he could hang up on a peg and consider again another day. Steam curls, bowls clink. The kitchen waits for more stories, and all stories taste better with warmth and company. Later, in tribunal halls where wood polish scented the air and windows watched the sky without blinking, witnesses described their treatment in POW camps. Some wore civilian suits made stiff by careful ironing, others kept their prison-issued jackets, their buttons polished by anxious thumbs. A few, when asked, explained that Americans had, in moments private and unremarked, refused requests to end life. They described a guard who snatched away a belt used wrongly, a nurse who stayed in a chair all night to keep a vigil, a chaplain who did not inflame shame. The gavel sounded like a knuckle knocking on a table, sharp and brief. The interpreter's voice threaded each language into the next, tight as a stitch that would not pull loose. The official record, seeking skeleton and not cloth, could not carry all of this tenderness, but it noted enough to keep the memory above water. The benches were hard. Feet shuffled just once, then settled as if remembering themselves. When peace arrived, not with trumpets but with paperwork and reclaimed farms and trains crowded with silent faces, men who had once asked to die discovered other tasks: to plant, to teach, to repair roofs, to carry water, to reopen shutters that had stuck. In fields where soil sucked at ankles, where frogs croaked loud enough to tickle the spine, former prisoners thought of guards who had refused their bitter pleas. They told their children to take baths, to be polite to grandparents, to pay back small debts on time. Cicadas sang, the sun cooked the backs of hands, and food smelled better than it had for a long while. The refusal had uncorked not only a life but a season of habits. When these men visited old precincts in their neighborhoods, some bowed toward a school gate, others toward a shrine, and only a few toward a monument. Their memories lodged in smaller places, a cup, a corner of a table, a patch of shade that met them like a friend. In an odd twist of continuity, a strip of cloth that had once been a prisoner's sash became a bandage torn by a Marine to wrap his own sprained wrist when his issued wrap turned out to be missing. He had confiscated the sash earlier, a ritual from a corner of prison processing that always felt both necessary and slightly sacramental. Later that day, the Marine watched the sash support him as he helped lift a different prisoner onto a truck. He described the sash's texture as both rough and surprisingly pliant, the fibers holding together under sweat and dust. He smelled the day's effort on that cloth, salt, earth, a keen nip of antiseptic from having used it to wipe down a canteen mouth. The prisoner who had worn it would live to receive a letter with fine-boned script from a daughter who explained third-grade arithmetic in tidy rows. Objects move away from their origins, and sometimes they circle back as quiet tools of care. Memoranda posted on plywood boards inside command tents explained with unconcerned words that mercy killing was forbidden, that prisoners remained under protection from capture through repatriation, that hands trained to act with violence must also practice restraint. These orders became a mantra murmured in squad tents at night, a backbone around which storytellers arranged their anecdotes. A young private, hearing it, felt relief. His moral world had a wall he could lean against when a man begged him to push the other way. The stapler that affixed the orders to the board punched a sharp, tidy punctuation into the page's corner. The staple's glazed silver shone. The file copy found its home in a folder, the edges gently rounded by many fingers. The note's routine existence did its work as effectively as a bright flare sent up over a dark field. There was a signal, it was seen, and men aligned themselves in their steps accordingly. The rain taps, the board creaks, the tent holds. Instructions don't have to shout to shape hands that hold and then release. A medic writing home chose his words with care, aware of the censor's blue pencil, but also aware of his mother's bedtime rituals. The way she would fold the letter back into the envelope twice after reading, then smooth it with her hand. He told of a night when he held a prisoner's wrist for hours, thumb pressed to the pulse, resisting the man's attempt to scratch a vein open. The medic skipped names and locations. He described instead silly details like the way his boot heel had worn through and how the iodine bottle cap stuck. He mentioned that the night smelled of wet wood and coffee that had boiled too long. He wrote that the man lived, that the dawn was a beautiful grey like his mother's hair. He let the letter rest before signing and, later, smelled its paper one last time, as if it could transport him into the room where she would read. An interpreter listened to a request that came with wires around it. A POW asked to send a message phrased cleverly to appear as a goodbye, but timed it to deliver an instruction to a unit still hiding nearby to take their own lives before capture. The interpreter understood both senses. He paused, and the pencil in his hand remained in air, unscribed. He answered that he would carry a different message, one that said the sender was alive and would see his comrades again, that they must resist despair and protect one another. He read it back slowly, so the words traveled a path whose grooves they could wear deeper with repetition. The prisoner looked at him for a long time, then nodded once, as if recognizing the logic. The pencil wrote on thin paper that wrinkled slightly as it absorbed the graphite. Outside, a truck backfired and everyone flinched. Inside, this refusal bent the future a few degrees toward morning. Night thins. A truck ticks as it cools. Words reweave themselves into lifelines, one syllable at a time, like knots along a rope. Midnight on an ocean transport stripped the world down to two colors, black and a paler black. A POW on a lower deck with the air moving slowly stood beside a porthole, listening to the water rush and pull, his face a shadow turned toward the sound. A guard noticed the man's fingers lingering on the latch that should have been secured. He stepped close and rested his hand on the metal, feeling the chill. The prisoner did not move away. He spoke, soft and urgent. The guard, heart slowing again after that quick drum, answered by sliding the porthole shut and then drawing up a stool. He talked about his hometown's small baseball field, where the sour smell of spilled soda gathered under bleachers. He offered a cigarette, which was declined. They sat in companionable quiet, letting their breaths find a synchronized rhythm. The ocean kept its steady talk, but the latch stayed cold under the guard's hand until it warmed. In field wards where light pooled like milk around cots, nurses moved between patients with a pace gentle enough to keep time from feeling like a pursuer. A prisoner, bone-thin and smudged by fever's chalk, whispered that he wished to be left alone in the corner to vanish into thinness. A nurse fluffed his pillow and turned him gently to prevent sores, moistened his lips with clean water, and left a cloth folded cool over his forehead. She refused not by argument, but by the repetition of care, the thousand small gestures that build a hammock under a falling body. The sheets smelled of bleach and sun, dried on lines strung between poles. The room's ambient sound was a soft chorus of coughs and the rustle of fabric. The nurse's shoes squeaked once on a damp board. Her hands were warm. She moved on to another patient, as if this refusal were only part of a string of ordinary tasks. In a map room lit by green-shaded lamps that cast an even, scholarly glow over paper and wood, a POW asked a colonel to grant him an honorable end instead of a dishonorable endurance. The interpreter repeated the words neutrally. The colonel looked down at a pencil shaved to a fine point, then up at the man. He poured water into a glass, not filling it to the top, and passed it slowly across the table. The man drank, eyes closing for a second, the cool length of the swallow written on his throat in a clean line. The colonel smoothed the corner of the map under a weight shaped like a small whale, and spoke about roads and bridges and units as if they belonged to a separate world, which they did. The request dissolved in the practical climate of that room, not ignored, simply cooled, like hot metal set on stone. The pencil made its small music on paper as it went to work gathering facts. The tent flaps burble. The pencil sings on paper. The night presses close to the lamp's radius, still, as if listening in. Textbooks later would compress scenes into paragraphs, faults into a line denoting everyone's common humanity, and prickly details into a smoother fabric. It is what textbooks often do. They preserve skeletons. But across decades, researchers peeled open envelopes whose glue had failed and boxes whose lids had warped. The archive rooms hummed with predictable climate, and gloves powdered with cornstarch left faint smears on the thin paper edges. They found more of those index cards from the record room, many with variations on the same phrase: request for death denied, self-harm prevented, refusal consistent with policy. These notes, pointed like arrows toward a quieter consistency beneath the loud campaigns that dominated the headlines. The clips had left dents in the paper's edge that could be felt with a fingertip, tiny permanent recordings of having been held. Students came in with notebooks. The dust, disturbed and shining in the shafts of fluorescent light, turned the air into a galaxy of minor stars. In neighborhoods where windows caught afternoon sun and warmed the rooms until echoes softened, families kept altars with photos in heavy frames and tablets inscribed with names stroked by calligraphy that felt like prayer in form. Wives and mothers and sons and daughters told a version of the war that fit the space. Much was made of perseverance and suffering. Little was said of surrender, not because it did not belong, but because shame's language is hard to pronounce. When, later, camp diaries came home, donated or borrowed or photocopied, they added a different softness. A widow read by lamplight a passage describing a guard's refusal to hand over a blade and found her grief shifting shape, as if a stone placed on top of a grave had been moved a few inches and some light had come through. The incense smoke rose and perfumed the air. She blinked into it and found no tears, only the careful focus of someone absorbing a truth she could live with. The altar warms, smoke curls, paper breathes. In rooms that keep memory, even small changes in story can lift a heavy lid. Veterans who returned to the ridges where they had once been ragged and cold found the air gentler than they remembered, a salt sweetness in it like a hint of fruit. They put palms on rocks that had been cover, tried to find old fighting positions with the muscle memory of their knees. They recalled a man with empty hands asking to be shot, his voice so calm the moment could have been a domestic scene, a request to pass the sugar. They remembered the grip on their own rifles, the debate that passed without words across a glance with their sergeant, the relief in a quiet refusal. They walked to the cliff's edge and looked down into white foam. Their breath made little clouds that lifted and vanished, like the fog of the rising tide dissolving at the shore. Below, waves pressed lace against stone in endless repetition. Rocks warmed in the sun, and the veterans stood like posts modestly marking an unbuilt fence. In squads strung like beads along a front, men established in formal codes, the injured prisoner would not be allowed to end himself under their watch, no compassionate shortcuts even if asked with dignity and style. These were moral orders enforced only by the look in an older sergeant's eye and the steady pressure of peers. The code had rituals old as congregation life, a slap away of a blade hand, a hand placed flat on a chest to hold down a rising panic, a shared cup not left full enough for drowning. A pocket Bible cracked when opened, its thin pages whispering. The mud clung to trousers with a familiar sucking sound, making movement heavier but solid. Matches went damp and left sulfur on fingertips when they failed to take, the smell like a minor lightning strike. In these small practices, a line was drawn again and again, a chalk mark laid fresh each dawn, an oath repeated in action rather than word. Reports from international visitors, stamped with symbols recognizable as belonging to a neutral metric of care, recorded moments when ritual attempted to intrude into controlled space, a prisoner, improvising a blade from unexpected objects, a guard's anticipatory knowledge dismantling the attempt with quiet efficiency. One entry described a man who used chopsticks sharpened against a rough brick to pierce his own skin. A guard, crossing the yard with a metal tray that clattered, saw the motion and moved. The guard's hands were quick, the sticks went clattering, and the prisoner found himself folded back into arms that restrained without bruising. The report noted both the attempt and the prevention, and then moved on to inventory food stores, a domestic segue. The report's red stamp bled slightly where ink had been heavy. The page smelled faintly of polish from the table where it had been written. These details insist the story is not hypothetical. The quiet refusal enters the record as perfectly ordinary. The rain dims. The stamp dries. A breath moves across paper. This is how bones of truth grow flesh, by leaning into ordinary detail and staying put. Film reels sometimes showed what words struggled to hold. A cinematographer captured a moment when a soldier pushed away a prisoner's hand from a water jug after noticing too much water being tipped back too quickly into a mouth already blue at the edges from an attempt to drown in a bucket. The correction, gentle, precise replaced danger with care. The film's grain glittered in projection like dust in a bright doorway. The projector had a voice too, a whir that rose and sank like a calm sea. That clip, considered too soft for public exhibition in the years when boiling down complexity served a national purpose, spent seasons inside a canister on a shelf, climate-controlled, watched by no one. Later, when eyes were readier, the film may have been spliced into a documentary that leaned closer to the human. The image itself carried its own music, the soldier's palm, the jug's tilt, the small nod that says we'll do this together now. In a long barracks where bunks made tattered lines like dry rice rows, the night turned particular, filled with ordinary noises that sometimes woke men suddenly, hearts alarmed. A guard sat on a stool with his back to the wall and listened to a prisoner ask, on the hour, to be killed. The voice was steady, the request unadorned. The guard's refusal became a rhythm, responses measured, a metronome, you will not die, you will not die, you will not die. After a while, the prisoner's shoulders seemed to relax at the predictable sound. The guard poured water from a tepid jug and listened to the glug and pause as air moved to replace liquid. The cot's cord gave under weight with a tired sigh. The guard rubbed at a scuff on his boot toe with thumb, a small care distracting him from his own thoughts. In such nights, refusal was less a policy than a lullaby hummed in the same place at the same time. The fan hums. A moth taps the shade. The breath of a room comes back around and settles like a blanket. In quieter years, veterans taught new recruits that battles have rules that keep men's minds from collapsing along with bodies. They taught that some requests must be refused even when forgetting them would be easier in the short term. They demonstrated on training fields where chalk lines turned soil into theory and the whistle lifted like a note from a flute. They told recruits that they themselves had survived because they did not step outside certain boundaries, that those limits were like railings along a stair, seem restrictive and then prove life-saving. The recruits inhaled dust that explained itself between their teeth, swallowed water that smelled faintly of hose rubber, and tried to remember the angle of arms, the curl of fingers that calmed rather than allowed. A bright sun flattened shadows, boots studded a language into ground. The lesson folded into bodies where it could be retrieved without thought when the special request arrived in a different war with a different flag raised nearby. The layers of discovery, suppression, rediscovery repeat like waves turning shells, smoothing edges until they reflect light without slicing. An index card sits, a clerk writes, a censor trims, a family breathes, a researcher reads, a museum arranges. The card's presence pushes back against bluster that would erase nuance, insisting that small refusals are strands in a bigger rope. The first discovery is always the moment itself, hands moving, the wetness of breath shared. The first suppression is habit, the tidy barracks talk that sorts the day's events into shareable and not. The rediscovery often happens quietly, in stacks, in murmured discussions over coffee brewed too strong in staff rooms. The rain hisses on the windows. The muffled joy of insight feels like finding a forgotten bill in a coat pocket, unexpected relief and affirmation that you have more resources than you thought. Then you write it down and make a place for it on a shelf. The horizon is wide. The file sits. Cabinet drawers breathe in and out. We do not finish. We assemble patience and let it show. It is tempting to chase closure, to wrap up the moral with string and place a label, to reassure ourselves that refusal inevitably made every participant a saint. It is not so clean. Refusal sometimes arrived late, sometimes the person asking did not wait, sometimes guards, under stress, failed, and then spent years learning what their hands could have held. But the pattern remains, a commitment to refuse requests for death from those already disarmed, vulnerable, under custody saved lives and steadied spirits. It preserved the possibility of conversation that could reshape the next hour and the next. It linked a medic in a tent to an interpreter at a cave mouth to a sailor on a wing to a clerk holding a pencil. It strengthened the law's spine. It made future trust just barely imaginable again where it had been mocked by gunfire. The rain lifted. Light returned to surfaces. A hand on a shoulder communicated a promise without case law or footnotes. The ocean at dusk absorbs stories and holds them without judgment. Somewhere, a canvas tag still exists in a box that smells like old wood and cold air. The ink on it slightly faded where a thumb rubbed it 20 times, absent-mindedly, while waiting for something to change. There is no conclusion to the record of those moments when men asked for ending and heard, in response, a refusal shaped like a cradle. The mystery does not close, it softens. It says that what made these refusals powerful was their everyday smallness, their lack of melody, their immediate practicality that nonetheless flowed from something older than tactics. This is not a legend where giants win. It is a series of rooms where lamplight makes a circle on a table, where a spoon touches the side of a cup, where a voice answers no and then adds something else. Bread, water, a pencil, a map, a long silence in company. The horizon does not decide, it keeps inviting.